Awesome. All right, welcome to the first meeting of the Last Estate Book Club, where we are going to, for the next 3 meetings, so that's like the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to talk about Demons by Dostoevsky, which is also, and by the way, this is Last Estate, like last.estate. Cultural arts, whatnot. I'm not very good at the introductions. Will, Rudy, if you want to jump in on what it is, I have no idea what it is. There's nothing else on the internet that's talking about like art, I think, in the way that we are at least trying to. Yeah, that's like my selling point for that.
I think you got it, man.
Great, I nailed it.
Yeah, you nailed it.
So Demons, Dostoevsky, the version I have is Pevier and Volohansky, P&V, which, like, kind of interestingly, when I read Crime and Punishment in a group thing a few years ago, everyone was like really anti P&V as far as translators. Like, apparently they were seen as like too literal and didn't get some of like the humor for Crime and Punishment, some of the more poetic whatever. But then for this book, I read that it doesn't really matter as much. So I have no idea. I think that you would have to have such an extensive knowledge of Russia during that time, the Russian language, and like translation to be able to make any sort of like real comment on which translation is better. But I do think it's interesting that this goes under at least 3 different names. Devils, Demons, and then what's yours, Jesse?
Mine is Devils.
Yours is Devils. Okay.
The third one is The Possessed.
So, like, right off the bat, those are 3 very different things just on the cover. You know what I mean? Like, Demons to me, I mean, I think that implies that there's one, like, sort of a group of people that have, yes, been possessed, but then they're then infiltrating some aspect of society. Whereas like Devils to me feels like it's already got a latent evil already there. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I think it kind of feels like either like all 3 of them sort of say something a little bit different. So you can already see how like the issue of translation comes up even from whatever the title is. And one of the things like I wanted to start off to talk about was one of the reasons I wanted to do this book club is we're reaching a point where like there's more and more books like constantly, right? And because of that, there's no time for all of us to like read everything. And so I feel like there's classics that are just going to basically fall off. Like, you know, they won't be, I mean, there's just not enough space in our heads, and reading already is, of course, like not a cultural priority in a lot of ways. So to me, I think this is kind of a cool way for people who like, if you're not going to read it at all, you get like more than a passing familiarity with something that is a classic and kind of understand like why it was, what was the relevance, you know, either through literature or the geopolitics of the time. And in that way, I was thinking it's kind of comparatively kind of cool to something like the Odyssey, where it's told orally for so long. And the version that ends up like in our culture and then in sort of a written culture basically boils down to like which version was told best, right? Like, because if it's being told spread across different cultures and stuff like that, and then we finally get printing press and we can now write down the Odyssey, then like the version that sticks is the one that had that poetry, like so that you remember the lines and so that the next stage and stuff like that. And it's like almost now with like, there's going to be an element, I think, as we go further into culture where like we almost have to tell the stories of these books because there's just literally not enough time to like read them all, if that, you know, makes sense or whatever. I think the last thing I wanted to say on it that was somewhat, sorry, I was looking down at a weird message. The last thing I wanted to say somewhat is that there was a big pull to me on this book for it's taking place in Russia, 19th century, but we're dealing with basically a political sort of setup that feels eerily familiar to right now. And I'm really interested in, so my own perspective of that is that right now it feels like a time where we have a ton of pent up energy, but it's not clear at all where that energy is going to release itself and whether that is going to be an evil, a good, a productive, a not productive. And this feels exactly like that to me, where it's like not entirely clear what's going to emerge from it. And we know now because of history, like what does emerge from it. But in this moment, it feels like they're kind of writing, at least socially and politically, in a very similar time and moment. So I'm going to go real quick and say, like, I read this first section. It's all I've read. So I have no other frame of reference. I never read it before. I've only read Crime and Punishment and Notes in the Underground. So if I was not doing this for book club, I do not know if I would have had the courage to keep on going, because it is extremely complicated to keep up with what the hell is going on. Like, it's not just the names. I printed out, like Jesse today posted a thing that was from his version. It had the list of characters. It was actually super helpful because it didn't have it. But like, it's not just the names, although the names are part of it. But like, it's just the fact that we're just in part one, moving basically from living room to salon to living room, like talking and arguing about like, not really totally clear what. I went and read like one of those like synopsis, and there was two things I had totally missed. Like, I had not really connected that there was maybe a marriage that had happened or not happened. And that like, I knew there was a woman who was like mentally ill and was like delusional, but I didn't realize that the mother at one point like thought it was a real marriage until, again, the synopsis. So there was definitely stuff that like, because it's kind of like extremely complicated about like who's talking about what, but that whole effect for me was kind of worked by the end, because what it seemed like was a lot of social jockeying for position amongst this like one group, and this sort of woman Vivara, who is the, you know, matriarch or whatever, has the little bit of money left, so the little bit of power, and is trying to like oversee and sort of control this little area, including her son and the tutor. So I don't know, like, partially because this is on YouTube, or going to be on YouTube, how much I don't typically on my channel like do any kind of like, here's what's happening. But I think briefly on this one, I will, since I know there's some people just sort of listening in. But essentially there is the woman Vivara who has a live-in, he was a tutor for her son, but that was 20 years ago, and he just still lives there. He has no money. Financial issues are definitely like part of their fight. There's this really great, like, this is, let's see, page 14. There's this really great description of friendships that kind of encapsulates them, and actually encapsulates several I've had in my life. But I loved this at the beginning of part 3 of part 1. There are strange friendships. Two friends are almost ready to eat each other. They live like that all their lives, and yet they cannot part. And it goes on to like, parting is impossible because one of them dies or whatever. And like those sort of parasitic relationships, like with, in my experience, has actually been usually male or whatever. But it's kind of interesting here that like, it is like sort of, she's got the money, and so she's got the estate, and he's got something like company, I guess, some sort of intellectual connection. So that's like what's going on with them. She has just come back from Switzerland, and her son is in Switzerland. And then this is where like the drama kind of starts, where her son has been seeing, I think, 2 women, possibly up to 3. It's not clear if he's married one. It's not clear if he's had a kid with one. And she's like, wants to figure out what's going on. Like, what's going on with my son in Switzerland? Who are all these people? Are they like trying to get something from me? But I guess before then, they actually do leave Russia, Stefan and her, right, to start these like literary salons kind of thing. which is kind of cool. It reminded me of Misery Loves Company. Like it was like all like the list of people that were coming to these things. They were like editors, writers, weirdos. Well, like, and it had that kind of vibe. And so she was trying to hold, what was it, hold evenings? I love that term, holding evenings. But and so there was, sorry, I forgot there was that aspect. But now we're like back in Russia trying to figure this out. And basically all the people that we've been talking about are around, like the people that the son knew, and then also Stefan's mysteriously son, they all coalesce at the end of part one, almost like a play, like where they're all in the room, everybody's gun is pointing to everybody else, you know what I mean? And that's where it leaves. I mean, it leaves with a punch. You think somebody's going to go punch him back, but he doesn't, just kind of stands over it. There is not, well, I think we're sure now that there's not been a marriage. Stefan might end up marrying one of the women that the other son was seeing, who might also be pregnant with the other son's kid, and that might be why they're marrying. I'm not entirely clear about that, but like that's essentially the whole action, right, of the first part. I'm going to ask Jesse, do you think I missed anything like major plot wise there?
No, and I have to confess, I just finished part 2 a few days ago, and I've already forgotten things that have happened in part 1. I'm enjoying the book much more after part 2 than I am after part 1. I felt a little lost, for precisely the reasons that you kind of talked about. I've never read any Dostoevsky other than Crime and Punishment, and Russian novels for me are hard because keeping track of the blur of names, takes a little time. But I will tell you that the book, in my opinion, gets better in part 2.
So does it get into some of the political, like, because that's really, I mean, it's talked about because they're in living rooms just talking. So yeah, like obviously the political stuff's coming up, but none of these people strike me as political. They all seem like regular social climbers.
Right. It's more about the society of the provincial town in the first part. And then the second part, not to spoil anything or give anything away, but it's more about the conspirators, the circle. And yeah, the first part seems to be just establishing the characters. It's challenging you to differentiate between the characters. And yeah, it's just like the setting up of the moving parts.
Very important plot. Nicola bites an old man's ear and kisses another. Yeah, lots of biting in notes. There is, yeah. It kind of like the provincial thing's a good point. It reminded me a little bit. There's this French book called Blood Dark by Malacroix. It's on NYRB, so sometimes it shows up and stuff. I read it a couple years ago, and it's like a send up of provincial culture, but it's impossible to read almost because it's hundreds of pages of like, who is this person? How did this person get here? But by the end, like similar to this, I think there is a dizzying effect of it's not so important that you like really gather every conversation and every participant as much as you understand the mood of like where everyone is kind of at right now. I have a couple things on here that I wanted. All right, there's a couple sections of things that I either thought were really, really funny or telling about the time that I wanted to note. One is like page 8, 9, where I think one aspect is Stephen is like, so he was a tutor, but he certainly was like had a role in education or something, and then was like kicked out, like government, like there was something to do with that. So there's an undercurrent of academia throughout, again, like kind of with the connection of today. And I really like Dostoevsky's like, and yet he was such an intelligent man, such a gifted man, even so to speak, a scholar. Though as a scholar, however, well, in a word, he did very little as a scholar, nothing at all, apparently. But with scholars here in Russia, that is ever and always the case. So like, I love the fact that like, so it doesn't seem, again, like thinking about the politics in a lot of like, societies or whatever, where there's going to be this like political uprising or political moment, you think of the academies as being somewhat involved one way or the other. But here he kind of castrates them right off from the bat, where it's like almost a governmental like clerk role. Like scholars don't do anything, like they're not at all involved. And that's page 9.
Yeah, one thing I like about that, the way Dostoevsky puts it, like the way how meandering that sentence structure, and that, you know, just him saying that he does nothing is. And a lot of the first section, at least, or the part that I only read about halfway through the first one we were supposed to read, but a lot of it is just him doing just that, just saying things in a really like meandering, drawn out way, and that, you know, it really hit me, because it's like it makes it feel, it gives you those neat vibes, basically. I don't really know any other way to put it, because like you said, it's a really complex situation, like with the living situation, where this guy is like Varvara Petrovna's, you know, like what is he? It's like he's a son, he's her son, I guess, but then you have these other people involved too, like there's another son, and then like, you know, he's dating someone, like, and you know, it's all, and like the living situation is super complex, and like just the way he portrays that, as like you said, like from salon to salon, and you know, living room to living room, you know, that kind of way is really, it's an interesting fucking vibe. I don't know, it feels distant because all the political stuff, but also feels really relevant to the times today.
And what you said also reminds me of like the other big mystery of this, which is who is the narrator and how does he have access to so much information? I mean, is he living there? Is he being further ahead? Like, do you think, Jesse, that we're going to find out that answer, or is that going to remain?
Well, it becomes a situation where there are parts where the narrator, who's named Govarov or G dash 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 V in my list of characters, where he is privy to conversations, and he talks about, and this is how I learned what they talked about in private on that one time. But then there's other parts where there's no way he could have been present, and there's no way he could have known perhaps what was going on inside the minds of characters. So it's really fluid, and it's not very definite at times, and it seems like that itself could be a kind of source for some comedy in a way, to me. I don't know why,
Is it a
but
stand-in for Dostoevsky clearly, and I'm just like
I have no idea.
I don't. So I could be wrong here, but I think that like present absent narrator thing is like a 19th century Russian literature thing, where you feel that where there will be this character who's functioning as a narrator, who is like the town gossip or something, who is like adjacent to these conversations, aware of them, but never really becomes a full-bodied character within the work. Actually, I think Ted Prokash kind of plays with this in his Russian pastiche novel there.
Nicola, I'm not gonna be able to pronounce it. Man, do you have the pronunciation?
Nikolai Andreevich, I think.
Yeah, you just nailed it. Okay, yeah, you nailed it.
But yeah, so I think that's like a trope of 19th century Russian literature that, and I could be wrong here because I haven't read that much, but I think that Dostoevsky is playing with here, where it's like, Rudy had an interesting thought about it, though. He was talking to me about the other day about the narrator who seems kind of omnipotent, but he's in the town and he's embodied in the town. I don't know, Rudy, maybe you want to throw your thought in here.
Well, I thought maybe, you know, since it's called the possessed or whatever, I thought maybe it was literally a demon or something like that, because, you know, he seems like he's there, present, but sometimes not present, privy to all the events, but really not like with any stock in them. And he seems, you know, I mentioned this to William, he seems kind of to be like a collector of like despicable people. Like I know that I haven't read a lot of like this kind of stuff like Dostoevsky or any Russian stuff, but I know there's some like literary traditions that like about that time, maybe like Bronte and like, you know, Dickens, maybe even have like their like collection, like this like rogues gallery of like really despicable shitty fucking people, right? And those are like kind of the people you're supposed to, you know, those are the characters that they're surround the narrator, surround the novel. So I mean, maybe I don't know really much about Dostoevsky, but I thought maybe it was something like I like the way it's done here better, basically, because I think it's like I have real trouble with like Dickens and like Bronte and a lot of those like the 1800s authors and stuff, because like I don't give a shit about like the politics and nobility expressed in those the ways they tend to do them. I guess I'm not sure really any other way to say it, but Dostoevsky, like the way he describes some of this stuff, it feels relevant. It feels more current, and I'm not sure why exactly that is. If it's because of the political stuff thrown in there or whatever. But I like to answer your question. I thought maybe the narrator was maybe like a demon or something.
Yeah, I mean, if not like a literal one, there's definitely a thematic thing there, I think, right? Where like, you know, but anyway, like one thing that I really like about this kind of narrator though, is you never fully escape the like the latent unreliability of the story, right? Whenever the narrator pops in, you're forced to be reminded of the fact that this is a story that someone is telling. And I think in that, like, you avoid some of the pitfalls of like third person omniscient rather, third person omniscient, where like you just take everything at face value. Oh, this is what happened this is what that character was definitely thinking, that this is what was definitely motivating the character. Instead, you have this like weird like town gossip go between where you're always forced to think, at least whenever he pops into the narrative, like, oh wait, maybe I can't trust everything I'm reading here. And that I like that better than straight like, you know, third person, like, oh, you're just God, you're just seeing this unfolding,
Well,
right?
and and you love an unreliable narrator too. I mean, this is like, you know, this is right up your wheelhouse. While we are talking about that, it kind of like dawned on me that it's worth mentioning how it was received, like in its actual time where it was released serially. You know, so you would get it in very little pieces in a newspaper, and follow this like definitely like Crime and Punishment, and I presume like most of his work. And it is really bizarre to read that kind of thing in 2022 and talk about it over a video screen. Do you know what I mean? With like people from like all over a world, you know, as opposed to here, like their entertainment options are tiny, you know? And so like, that's like all there is like, here's the new story. But he actually think he gets away from like the thing I don't like, Rudy, about about the stuff you were talking about is how much filler and fluff is in there. That's like kind of, I mean, not that it's irrelevant, but it like gets a little tiring to kind of go over. But these,
Definitely.
like, maybe because it's because of the comedy or the satire aspect of some of it, like each of the conversations in the living room, even as I roll my eyes and we're like, all right, we're in a new living room, they're all funny. So it's like, you kind of get it where you'd like be sitting like whatever year it was, and like you'd get the new version. It almost doesn't matter if the plot moves forward today because it's like, it's hilarious, like who's the next whatever. So I thought a lot about like the way that it was like contemporaneously received, but then our short attention spans, like weird techno world, like we're going to receive it obviously completely differently, to where I'm going to be like, oh, there's a lot of moving around. You know what I mean? Where it's like, yeah, well, there wasn't, what else are they going to do? Go outside and chop wood? Like, you know.
Oh, it's weird because now that you mentioned that, like the narrator almost feels like the provincial like court board, like gossip board, or like some kind of forum or something, basically, where everybody just comes and drops their shit, like only serves a purpose to like, you know, for other people to narrate, you know, and for other people to drop their shit. So it's
Like the
weird.
town crier, like,
Yeah, kind of like, yeah.
yeah. I do think that I did not get a sense that he was evil necessarily. I got the sense that he had a very clear opinion on the matters that he was about to tell us about, and that he was poisoning the well for us in one way or other. I just don't know yet how. Like, but I clearly think that he, like on the unreliable bit, is like, I'm going to tell my version of these events, you know, but I didn't necessarily get like a dark kind of evil vibe. I wanted to
Oh, I like that he's gossipy. I
I
think that
know.
there's this sense in which, because it's so focused on kind of like these like petty squabbles amongst, in particular, the men and also Varvara and Stefan in particular. That yes, it's a political novel, but you cannot get into the politics because everybody's almost into the politics because of like ego reasons or because of pettiness. Even the evenings that she wants to put together are not because she wants to move forward any sort of intellectual ideas or anything like that. It's simply to increase her status, right? And to make sure that Stefan is not just like, if he's going to be her kept man, right, that he's also like participating in intellectual society. So everything is done with these airs and for the wrong reasons. I think it's such a funny backdrop, and to have this sort of gossip and to focus so much on like the things that seem very provincial and everything like that, I think adds to the like hilarity in these sorts of things.
I think so too. I love that point. I'd forgotten, like, yeah, she does that thing where she wants him, like, she's disappointed when he's not impressive at the salons, and like trying to like like put him on to like these different meetings, and I'm like making him seem so much bigger. And then they get back to Russia and she like hates him again, or treats him just like her little servant boy or whatever. Like, I kind of forgot about that element. It was pretty good.
Yeah, it's funny.
Actually, I wanted to add something about what was just said. I think the point is, and I'm going to try to not spoil it because I did read the whole book. And I also have a Russian grandma, so I'm kind of familiar with the context. But I wanted to add that I think Dostoevsky is really trying to just show that they're trying to adapt to values that are so foreign because they're European to Russia, that it just happens on a very superficial level, and it can really not be adapted to the lifestyle. And I think it says a lot that I think I forgot the names too. The names were very stressful for me as well. But Piotr, who is like the son of Stefan, and he's like supposed to be the perpetuator of these Western values later on. His nickname, Petrusha, is also a name for a puppet in like traditional Russian carnival culture. And I think that's really telling because he's literally sort of like a puppet.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Oh damn, yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and the pun on puppet there works, not to give too much about that character away, works into the demon possession angle too, like the implied demonic possession kind of angle too, in a way where he's a, but anyway, I don't want.
Well, it's kind of cool doing it like this too, because like when like some people have read part of part one or none, or me, I've just read part one, right? And like then like in 6 weeks or whatever, when we're done, look back and it's like, oh, that thing I thought in the beginning was totally stupid or sounded whatever, you know what I mean? But like that's kind of the experience of reading a big book, you know what I mean? Like,
no, it's funny for me because this book, it was one of those experiences where like reading it, I won't say painful because that overplays it, right? But where it's like an arduous read, where it's like an exhausting read that you're kind of pulling yourself like hand over hand through, but then you close the book and it's like things click over and you're like, that was exhilarating, right? I guess it's like running a marathon or something, one of those experiences where it's just mentally and emotionally exhausting, and then afterwards you feel like you've had this like moment of intense catharsis or insight or
I didn't think Crime and Punishment was like that. I thought Crime and Punishment, because you were inside his head of going through the wrecked guilt and stuff, like I thought that made it super easy for the pages to fly by. Did not care if I missed the name of a clerk or whatever, because I just want to like sink into his psyche. But this, it kind of is more difficult because it's like you're being led the whole time, again, unreliable narrator, but I don't know if I'm like attached to any particular character. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Derek, I wanted to say one thing that I've noticed, because like as I'm reading the book, I don't feel like, or maybe I'm missing it, but I don't feel like there's a main character. It's a body of personalities. It's a cast of characters, and it's sort of not unified around a particular person. Maybe Nikolai in a sense. One other thing I wanted to say was, going off of what Sophia was talking about, it seems like one of the big themes for Dostoevsky is Russia Europe or is Russia Asia?
Yeah.
And I read The Gambler, and in that there's a lot of talk about how some Russians resented Europe and resented European influence, and others kind of embraced it. And I thought that was really interesting, and it gets treated kind of in this book in a way. And maybe that kind of plays into the issue of revolutionaries and liberals. Like, what does liberal mean? I guess Stepan Trofimovich, or however you pronounce his name, is supposed to be like an old liberal, a kind of outdated teacher figure who is held up for some kind of comic treatment because he's like the father, and the kids are coming in to fill the gap left by the older generation. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think of part 2, Derek, because it's, to me, that's where the center of gravity of the book kind of is coming so far. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Well, the Europe-Asia thing, like, has kind of coalesced more tonight, as like Sophia talked about it, and you as well. And it's, again, like when you talk about the relevance, like there's a literal war going on right now that has very much to do with that, right? I mean, whether this region is going to join a European, one part of it, or one part that used to be a part of it. God, it's really hard to talk about that stuff without like trying not to offend either way, like what it is. But like whether Ukraine is Europe or Russia is very, very important. Do you know what I mean? And like those sort of ideas seem like they are right out of here, like that same sort of thing, like where I'm assuming that there's an element right now of the Russian population that feels like Ukraine is the puppet. They are being used and abused by the West, to be like, and then once the West gets their grips in them, all they're going to do is take all of their resources and any of their wealth or whatever. Like, I'm sure that is like definitely an aspect, like politically now. And it seems like it's still even then, like. All right, I got to do my ideologues thing. I really, really liked this this is like on page 30. I thought this could work for every single, for anyone that I've ever known who gets, including myself, because it has happened to me as well, who gets really sucked into an ideology for any period of time. He talks about, he was one of those ideal Russian beings who can suddenly be so struck by some idea that it seems to crush them then and there, sometimes even forever. They are never strong enough to master it, but they are passionate believers. And so their whole life afterwards is spent in some last writhings, as it were, under the stone that has fallen on them and already half crushed them. And I thought about how depressing it is that like an ideologue, I feel like the idea is like, okay, we want a better world, or I want a better system or whatever, so that something is fairer, we're happier, more opportunity. Well, and this paints it really as like, once you get stuck into an idea there, it will crush you. Like, and that was brutal.
I think that's the possession by the demon, and the nihilism and atheism that it seems like Dostoevsky is critiquing, maybe not explicitly in part 1, but seems like later, is this ideological fascination and purity in the minds of people. And the way it plays out in particular in Russia, it seems like Russia is a special case for ideas that rule people and become a revolution, and there's a note in my book in the back, because there's like notes in the back that talks about how Dostoevsky wrote in a notebook, nihilism is a servility of thought. like it's a slavery to an idea in a way maybe that beliefs, it's almost like the difference between belief and thought. I don't know. I don't fully understand it, but yes, the ideal, I think the ideological stuff is really interesting.
I think that feels like another
Yeah.
connection to now too. Like the energy that I feel and see is, it feels like desperately wanting an alternative to nihilism, you know, like desperately wanting an alternative to shit posting and irony, and like all, like really wanting something that isn't, you know, like that has some meat on its bone.
But also an alternative to like old liberalism, right?
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
exactly the tension you see. If I remember the novel correctly, it's been 5 years, but like that's exactly the tension you see here, right? You see in Stepan Trofimovich, in Stepan, you see this like the failure of like old liberalism, right? Like there are these wonderful liberal ideas, many of which I personally subscribe to, right? And you could see like how it, like the callowness and the self-centeredness and the narcissism, and like how all of the like pettiness of human life has hollowed out that ideal within Stepan, right? And then the apparent alternative to that within the novel is nihilism. And I don't want to, like, once again, you're like part one, I don't want to talk about how ugly or not ugly it gets, but I feel like we're seeing the same shit today, right? Yeah. Like liberalism has, I think, for our generation, like hasn't lived up to its promise, you know, in a very material way. And I think you're seeing like a real turn towards often very nihilistic and destructive politics as an alternative to that. And I think this novel is kind of a critique of both of those things. And the alternative, if I remember, that Dostoevsky offers, I won't get too much into, but like it's a kind of traditionalism, right? Which we can quibble at or not, but and you see that same sense kind of tension today too, where there are some people who are like, well, the only alternative here is a kind of return to religion, or return to spirituality, or return to some kind of traditional worldview. But sorry about that.
Well, no, it's interesting that like it doesn't seem like there's been any new option in however many years, right? Like there's not, I mean, there's been all this like human thought and supposed progress, at least intellectually or whatever, like, and yet like it's still the same question of like, you know, nihilism versus a kind of new liberalism, which maybe you could call like a humanist sort of approach, I guess, or like a traditionalism, a religion, you know what I mean? Like it seems like it's the same thing, and that's, maybe it should only depress me, or maybe it shouldn't depress me, but it seems somewhat odd that like there would have been nothing else that our minds could have like put forth as an alternative.
I mean, I think the issue there isn't so much in political systems as it is, or maybe I'm getting a little bit too Dostoevsky here, is so much as it is like in the human soul, right? Or in the human psyche. Like we really, it's not that our imagination is limited, it's that we are really flawed, vain, nasty little critters, and like our idealism always gets hollowed out, right? Our idealism is always, I mean, like I think it was Eva who was like talking earlier about like the status climbing aspect of the novel, right? And my God, the way that parallels like Twitter politics, right? I remember thinking even like back in 2016 or whatever, when I read this, like, oh my God, like you see this every day online, right? That like the mask of like ideological benevolence and ideological meaning or moral meaning being used to hide like just absolutely craven social posturing. And this exposes it like so in such a nasty way, but yeah.
Yeah, I thought about like, oh, go ahead, Eva. No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
I think the hollowness is particularly interesting if you compare it to something like Crime and Punishment, where he takes an idea, he takes nihilism and he takes it to like its furthest extreme. And it's perhaps like best seen in the epilogue, where he's hanging out with all of the other nihilists, and they're all kind of killing each other. And it's like this ludicrous sort of like situation, and it's like comical, and it's insanity. Whereas this one, it maybe perhaps like there's been a lot of conversation here around how it feels very much like what we think of now, and it feels like you're reading something that is very contemporary. And I wonder if in part it's because it's looking at the baseness of people. And I like what Sophia had to say earlier, which is that, and how because of the baseness of people, and it's hard to actually take in ideas and make them your own. Like there's like this natural, and maybe this is why we've kind of continuously looped around some of the same ideologies, but they're hard to kind of like actually fit in. They don't actually quite fit so well.
Yeah, and I think he's also Dostoevsky was a believer of the fact that Russians are unlike anyone else in this regard, which is funny because this book is so relatable to almost anyone else. But he believed that Russians really take any idea and turn it into a religion. They don't like try to fit it in logically with their perspective, but they just like raise it up as an ideal and treat it very emotionally. And that's why he thought that nihilism sort of did not make sense for a Russian person, because they would just treat it as a religion. There's no real denial of anything. And I think that's really appropriate today, because I feel like people defend ideas without translating that to like really applying it to their lives. And also I feel like in the world we're trying to apply ideas from another time and another like social context that don't really fit anymore, because our society has changed so much since the 20th century. So that's also kind of relatable.
Yeah, there's another thing that I had on 204, he called it the nervous, tormented, and divided nature of people in our time. And like that was another one where it's same thing, like the nerve. He's like placing it firmly in Russia and firmly in that time. And I feel like I keep trying to like say like, no, it feels pretty like now, you know what I mean? Like that it doesn't seem uniquely Russian. And obviously I have no way of like, do you think that there is something to that he's got, that there is something about like the Russian people or whatever, where it would be more emotional than any other?
Yeah, I think the only difference, I think this would probably be unrelatable to an American, but relatable to a European who's like really entrenched in the culture. And that is looking for sort of like a big brother as a protection figure. I feel like Americans are sort of like allergic to the idea of someone who decides for you but provides protection. And it's sort of the opposite for Europe. I feel like Europe constantly struggles with is protection and security worth being controlled? And sometimes they think the answer is yes, which in my opinion is a problem. But I think that's sort of the only difference, where nowadays with sort of culture being globalized and sort of more shaped by America, I feel like people are letting go of the need to feel the security at the expense of their freedom.
That's so well freaking yeah, that's
I had a quick thought about contemporary times that kept popping into my head when I was reading it. And this may be projection, but during COVID, I think it was close to 16 million people in the United States moved, for various reasons. And there was a big to do about Californians, going to Texas or say Colorado. So there's a lot in the book where it's almost about this town and like preserving some way that they lived, and then these radical revolutionaries are bringing new ideas that are corrupting the old system. And I just thought about, that kind of juxtaposed in my mind, like, the kind of horrible idea was, these people are coming to bring their, revolutionary ideas to our state or whatever. And they're going to vote this certain way. It's going to change the voting demographic in our town. We've had for 100 years that ran a certain way. So I guess it's about change itself. But I do agree, like, that's kind of maybe projecting onto the book a little bit. I think the intricacies are more tailored to Russia and pre-revolutionary ideas that were in the air and stuff like that.
Well,
but weird thought.
No, that's a really cool thought. And I did want to say, like, even though it's a little bit of a tangent, like, I have noticed, so I live in an area of America that I think is the second, it's either been the fastest growing or the second fastest growing, for the past maybe 10, 15 years. In the Raleigh, North Carolina area, where a bunch of people, particularly from up north, have like come down, and then tech jobs from the West, right? And here, having grown up in North Carolina, there was that same fear amongst a lot of people that, like, oh, all these super liberals are going to come in. And ironically, they call them coastal liberal. I mean, an hour and a half is the beach. I don't know how we wouldn't be, but anyway, but they're gonna all come here. And one interesting thing that I've noticed is that at least politically, it's been the opposite. People have come and soaked in more of the political conservative culture here than have necessarily brought their own ideas or whatnot. Do you know what I mean? Like, it feels like it sort of like has such a stronghold, like the geography of a place where you're at, and that sort of the people that have like kept on their own stories and their own churches and their own lives, like that affects people coming in, it seems to me, more than it affects the other way around. It's harder to change someone that's standing right there, kind of thing. Again, kind of off, but connected to that. Anything else on demons we want to talk about tonight? I had a couple other like funny, like, I really like in these older books, seeing things that the way something would be described. And I just really, on page 44, they talked about, there was a guy who had something of the woman in him. And that turn of phrase like stopped me, like underline whatever, because, okay, clearly, and how appropriate on the US Marines Pride Month to even be discussing it. But like, when you say something of the what, like, clearly that must mean what it is. And it then, like, I think he immediately goes into something of, but he came from a good family, which is also really interesting to see. Like, he had something of the woman about him, but was from a good and well-connected family, which explains how he could sit with us for so many years, constantly brushing all business aside, like how he's able to be with us. Because, I mean, he was something of the woman of him, but he was from a good family and they had a lot of connections, so we let him hang out. I mean, it's really an interesting turn of phrase for that time period.
No, and that like brings up something that like a few people have touched on already tonight, but I do want to like really underline heavily, which is this is Dostoevsky's funniest novel by far. This, like, yeah, it's dense. Yeah, it's full of ideas. Yeah, it's hard. But fucking Stepan is like one of the funniest fucking characters I've ever read in any book, right? Like maybe outside like Catch-22 or something. And like, he's such an effective like satire of like a type that still somehow fucking exists today, even though like all the social structures like that existed in 19th century Russia do not exist in 21st century US, right? This guy, this type, like this particular kind of like liberal, intellectual, pretentious dude, like you see him on Twitter every day, you see him in the news media every day, like, and I've never seen that character like skewered so effectively, that type skewered so effectively, but also like with the amount of depth and humanity and psychological complexity you get here, where by the end of the novel, like without giving too much away, I think he's the character you end up feeling the most like honest empathy for. Like, at least I walked away feeling like this is the most complete human being Dostoevsky has handed us here. So I don't know. It's just a really fucking funny novel, and I don't think we should forget that. Maybe.
I think it is really funny. And part two, again, I really anticipate everybody reading part two because that's where it really gets going for me. But it seems like you're supposed to be laughing at Stepan's constant use of French. He's always putting French phrases in there, and I think you're supposed to be detecting some mockery from Dostoevsky of that character trait. Back to the influence of Europe, and we're trying to be global, or maybe global is the wrong word for 19th century Russia. It would be a word that means something today, globalist. But then again, the revolutionaries are kind of globalist too. The Internationale they talk about. Again, this is part two shit. So, but it is really funny, and yeah, I really look forward to next week. Or is it next week, or is it 2 weeks? Or
no, I did an extra one because part two is so big.
Yeah,
and the way that like I really wanted to read it like to stop, and like I really like that we're in different sort of phases. But the next one is, I think it's 2 weeks. I'll definitely obviously I'll post a thing on there. I had a schedule, but I think it's 2. There's an extra week built in, so it may actually be 3 weeks, and then the other one is 2. However it worked out. But this one, I think part 2 was the biggest chunk. Was as far as like amount of pages.
Right.
Yeah, and I didn't know at all with tonight and stuff how it would all work. I mean, I mentioned before we press record, whenever I do my booktube stuff, I literally just put a phone up and start talking. I never ever edit it because I don't. If I had to learn how to edit, that'd be awful. And I wouldn't edit this or anything like that. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to be a filmmaker. That's not gonna happen. So I just get up and talk, and the way that the reason I did it is because I would get done with books and I would want somebody to talk to about it and have no one. Do you know what I mean? Because I live on a cul-de-sac, so there's just not. I can't walk across the street and be like, have you read Demons? But this gives so much energy, and I really really enjoyed kind of looking at it this way, and I'm actually more excited right now to get back into part 2 than I was when I started the thing. Because when I started the thing, it was yeah, this is funny for sure, but wow, it's a slog. I was definitely a 3 to 4 page at a time, and put it down. And normally with stuff, I tear through stuff. Do you know what I mean? I get really obsessive. If there's an author I like, I can sometimes go through a weekend. I think I finished the Fonte stuff literally in 2 weekends when I got nuts about that. You know what I mean? Whereas this was 3-4 pages, put it down, go play with the kids. And now I kind of have that energy and drive to dig into part 2 and where the hell are we going? Because I do not see even yet how there's going to be enough conviction among any of these characters to be involved in something political. And so that's what I'm most interested in seeing. I feel like we could distract them easily with another estate or any they seem very easily distracted to me.
Speaking of aspects of modernity that end up kind of humorously in this, there is this one scene that I can't believe nobody's mentioned where he's talking about writing her letters and how she interacts with them, where she reads them and then she kind of pretends that they didn't happen. She'll read them obsessively and then silently judge. He's talking about texting.
I didn't even think of it that way. You're exactly right. And that's great because you would pretend and she would put it in there and pretend she hadn't read it, but then go back again. I had not thought about that at all. It's exactly like texting. Yeah. Because now we have this whole culture based on how quickly I respond, how quickly anyone responds, how deep the response is, and they're doing that with the letters.
Neurosis is an immortal thing.
Just as an aside about modern shit that's in there that's kind of weird, did I misunderstand this, or does Varvara Petrovna own some kind of magazine, and then they say like there's one part where it says like early next morning 5 literary men called on her, 3 of them complete strangers whom she's never set eyes on before, and then they like try to like take her magazine over, like take her lit mag over. I'm thinking like, holy shit, like it was just such a like wild, like I don't know. I know I'm drawing a lot of comparisons to modern stuff that obviously didn't exist, but like I guess the idea of like, you know, the salon and the, you know, that kind of thing, it existed even then. So it was weird to see that.
I love that whole section too. I kind of ran over it pretty quickly, but when they did move away and we're doing the salon, because yeah, it did seem complete. I mean, I wrote in the thing like MLC, it really did remind me of that. Like, because it was just, and there was the element too, like you said, of like, oh no, we're going to take it over. Like that did well. No, that's ours now. Like, you know what I mean? We'll do that. And it was all careerism. It was all like based on that, you know, that actually the only other note I had on there that I did want to, was from that beginning of those salons, the description of this is purely from a language thing, but like they went and stayed in Petersburg for almost the whole winter season. By Lent, however, everything burst like an iridescent soap bubble. The dreams scattered, and the jumble not only was not clarified, but became even more repellent. I mean, first the high connections all but failed, except perhaps in microscopic form and with humiliating strain. That, I mean, that is really, really good writing. I mean, like, really good. It was the one, that was the one of part one where I had the like, you know, circle through like just from language, like that was great. And that was them describing like their time in Petersburg and how there was this high of these salons and holding evenings and connections, and then everything burst, you know, like I loved that.
Can I say something? Can I say something that touches on that a little bit? I know we're probably out of time, but this was something that I thought was kind of an interesting point, which sort of relates to that, is I've been thinking about this quote, and it seems like I keep coming back to William Faulkner saying, so-and-so is a failed this, and, you know, novelists are failed short story writers. But I seem to remember a quote from him or somebody saying that Dostoevsky was a failed playwright, and that what he should have done was written plays, which I disagree with because of what you just said. There's so much internal novelistic technique that would not be capable, you would not be capable of doing necessarily in a play where there's just dialogue. Also, the setting switches from place to place so much that you could never do that on the stage. And it must be a novel, you know.
I think with Mark today, Mark Blickley mentioned that he had seen a performance of Demons as a play. I do remember something of that. And, you know, Gaddis was hugely influenced by Dostoevsky. He had claimed, actually, I think, that not Joyce, but Dostoevsky was like his muse, and that's where he got. And one thing that I did forget to say, that I definitely this time saw it. I did not Crime and Punishment, but so far, like this, the recognitions, like the confusion between like whose New York apartment that we're in and who's talking junk about who or whatever, like feels somewhat relevant to the way that the demon, you know, the way that this unfolds in that first section. And I just like, you know what reminded me of that is like when you said the dialogue piece, like one of the things about Gaddis always was like, why was JR not a play? You know what I mean? Like, why was it even, you know, a novel? What if you are just going to do dialogue, you know, what is the purpose of that? And that's a whole nother conversation. There's a great purpose for it and all that other, but reminded me of that. All right, I think we've hit 10. I think this worked really well. We're going to come back. There might be some more of us. There are about 15 total that like, we're like, I'm going to come or not come to these things or whatever. So we're just going to roll with it and see how it goes. We're going to go Demons, and then hoping that there's enough interest to where somebody else says, all right, I want to lead the next one, because frankly, as I mentioned right off the top, I am so, or actually I told William this before we started, at MLC on Fridays, which I go to religiously and regularly when I can, my whole joy in that is I can participate as much as my balance at that moment allows me to participate. So if I want to be super outgoing and whatever, then I can make fun of people, and then do that. And if I want to just be quiet and weird and eat a sandwich, I can do that. But William has to like show up and like give instant literary analysis and criticism, which I don't understand how anyone can do. And so I was super nervous about tonight because I had to like somewhat host or lead or whatever, but all of you made it so comfortable and easy and awesome. And it was wonderful. So thank you all so much. I'm going to hit stop recording.